How much is too much, right? Majority of processed meat products are going to tolerate about 1.5 to 2% salt of the total product. That is product dependent. It also depends on your consumer's preference. Sometimes I have products out there that I perceive as being very salty. How can this company be making a salty product? But they're selling it. So there are people who like it, right? So it's understanding who your consumer is and giving them what they like.
Welcome to MeatsPad, a platform dedicated to sharing breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the meats industry. These discussions help foster and improve communication and knowledge dissemination within the meat science community. This podcast is brought to you by the U.S. Meat Export Federation, the National Provisioner, UltraSource, the new standard for innovation. Dry Age Pro makes dry aging in-house flexible, safe, and affordable.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. My name is Francisco Najar. I'm your co-host today. We have Dr. Phil Bass from the University of Idaho. How are you, Dr. Bass?
I'm excited as usual, Francisco. I have to give some context to the speaker that we're about to have. As many folks may already know or have assumed, Francisco's native language is Spanish, and that is not mine, obviously. I am excited to have a conversation with an individual now who has already recorded a Spanish version with MeatsPad, a Spanish version of what we're about to talk about today. And for those who do speak Spanish as their native language, we do have the great opportunity with the Spanish version of MeatsPad out there. Check it out. But this is my opportunity to kind of get a chance to visit with that interview person. Today we're gonna talk about some processed meats. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And let me go ahead and kick this off. As you just mentioned, we had a very interesting conversation last week with Dr. Tarté. We have him on again. I begged him, hey, could we do this now on English for folks in the U.S. and Canada and other parts of the world that they don't speak Spanish? And I think we had a blast on that episode, and I think we want to just turn that into the English version of this episode. But let me introduce. We have Dr. Rodrigo Tarté from Iowa State. Welcome, Dr. Tarté. How are you today?
Very good, Francisco. Very good. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. And let's talk. As Dr. Bass said, we'll talk about processed meats. And I know we had on our previous episodes we had Dr. Campbell from Penn State, and he talked about curing. And I think folks, very small and mid-sized meat processors, asking more about non-meat ingredients. And today we're just excited to talk about salt and the importance of salt. Before we start that conversation, Dr. Tarté, please just tell us a little bit about you, about your background. I know you got some experience from the industry standpoint. I think you can relate a lot to also Dr. Bass. He went and worked for the industry and then came to academia. And I think we're going to start that conversation from that standpoint, and then we can continue with our topic. Welcome again.
Hey, thanks, Francisco and Phil. Yeah, sure. I'm Rodrigo Tarté, and I'm an assistant professor in the animal science department at Iowa State. My research is obviously in meat science. I am focusing more specifically on processed meats, meat functionality, and non-meat ingredients, usage and functionality, meat product formulation, and also food safety issues as well. It's really nice to be joined by someone who took the non-traditional path to academia. Because we get into the private sector first and then move to academia. Most people do it the other way around.
Right.
And I worked for almost 20 years after graduate school in the private sector. Spent 3 years working for a major meat processor in Colombia, South America, and then moved back to the States and worked for quite a number of years, about 11 years or so, for Kraft Foods and their meat products division called Oscar Mayer. And then the last 4 years of my industry career, so to speak, were spent the Morrell Food Group, which is today the Smithfield. I think they call it the processed meats sector or something like that, the processed meats business. And so been in Iowa State since 2015. So they do research, as I mentioned, in areas of meat processing. I also teach about 3 courses: our introductory meat science course, our processed meats course, and our advanced meat processing graduate level course as well. So,
with your experience from industry, which is extremely valuable, and yeah, you're right. You know, I came from industry, went into the academic world. You're coming from industry, going into the academic world. I feel that the successes that I've had so far in the academic world have a lot to do with my mellowing out period in the industry, and hopefully, like a good whiskey, I'm just that much better to prepare our younger folks out there interested in what it is that we talk about, and to give a kind of a slightly different perspective to the research that we do. Focusing on your experience, and especially in the processed meats world, as Francisco's already alluded to, salt is going to be one of our most important non-meat ingredients, maybe with the exception of water, right? Salt is going to be one of our most important non-meat ingredients. It's the thing that makes sausage, and salami, and ham. And first, I think what would be important to talk about is kind of the original uses of salt in meats. Historically speaking, it's because of food preservation. It's because of food safety. How does salt, from a scientific perspective, how does salt help with meat product safety in processed meats?
Yeah, so you're right. The safety and preservation was the original usage of salt when people started figuring out that salting meat actually made it last longer, right? And so salt has really the layman's term way to put it, the salt can dehydrate foods, and in that way deprive microorganisms, bacteria, yeast, and molds that also want to grow. What I tell my students is, you know, meat is a good food for us. So, and it's also a good food for bacteria. So we're always trying to outcompete the microorganisms that want to essentially eat our lunch before we do. And so salt was identified centuries ago as a way to inhibit the growth of these organisms. And it does it primarily by drying out, depriving these microorganisms of the water that they need to be able to grow.
And one of the cool things about salt, from my chemistry experience, is that it has this affinity to water, and by binding up that water, right, it makes that less available to the microorganisms, which rely so heavily on the water that's in the meat. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. You're right about that. And binding water is one of the things that salt will do in meat products. It's not what we usually think about when we use salt in our kitchen, right? When we use salt in our kitchen, we usually think of salt as a kind of like a flavoring agent. It has salty taste, and it also can enhance flavors. And we use it in that way in the industry too. But the other benefit that most people may not be aware of, but the salt is doing this, even if you're not aware, is that the salt is actually helping bind some of the moisture. Think about it when you're mixing meats, ground meat, to make meatballs at home, right? You add salt, and if you pay close attention, once you add salt and you keep kneading and mixing the meat, eventually that meat starts becoming kind of sticky. So those are some of the proteins that are being solubilized in the salt that you've added, and those become kind of sticky, and that allows those proteins also to bind water. Okay, so it's not, in this case, it's not just the salt directly, but the salt acting on the protein, getting those proteins to be extracted. Those meat proteins are soluble in salt, and so once those get exposed, then they can help bind the meat pieces together, give your meatballs cohesiveness, make them stick together. But in other products where we have water, they can also come in and help. Those proteins can come in and bind that water, but the proteins will not be able to bind that much water if we don't first expose them, and we do that through the action of salt.
Talking about some of those specific proteins that are within meats, there are some that act or become more active when salt is present. And for those who are meat processors out there, that's the reason why that sausage gets nice and sticky after you've included the salt in and you've allowed that mixing to occur. You're exposing those proteins. And so salt is this, I'm going to call it magical item that we can utilize relatively inexpensively, but creates this amazing texture and usability of meat products later on.
You touched on meat processors, and I think this is a good opportunity just to visit briefly about this. We talk about salt-soluble proteins, specifically some like myosin. That we could just briefly talk about. Myosin is a one protein present in meat, and we add salt in a batter. That's what Dr. Bass alluded to, and also I think a key here is the temperature of processing. I think that can be a take home message. Could you please tell us? Are we talking about temperature processing and mixing? Is temperature important when we're talking about this protein extraction, or to just optimize this for a better texture while?
Yeah. Well, the basic rule is colder is always better. So when you're mixing a sausage batter or even working with an injected item where you may have salt in the brine solution, you want to keep that as cold as possible. You get better protein extraction at a colder temperature. You also keep your batter cold, and it's no secret that meat and meat products are highly perishable items. So that will also help keep bacterial growth in check even during the process. Absolutely. So typically, if you're when we're talking, and what types of temperatures are we talking about? What I usually tell people, like a sausage maker, I mean, try to get, if you can get those batter temperatures into the low 30s or upper 20s for temperature, if you're able to do that, that would be a big advantage. And how do you do that? Any number of ways, right? So some companies will have, say, jacketed mixers where you can run some refrigerant through it. But if you don't have that, you can also use ice to also try to keep your temperature down. Ice is a much more effective cooling medium than just water. No matter how cold your liquid water is, ice will always be better. So yeah, try to keep those cold. And another reason also is as you continue to process, say if you're going to run your sausage batter through extensive mixing or through an emulsifier and then a stuffing system and all that, every time you're adding that, you add mechanical energy. You apply mechanical energy, you're applying heat to the product. So the product is going to take that mechanical energy, convert that to heat, and the product becomes warm throughout the process. So if you start out very cold, you're always going to end up a little warmer, but you won't end up as warm as you would otherwise.
With along the lines of advice to processors, I love the discussion about keep that meat cold. Something that, when we're teaching our labs about emulsified products, the water portion that we do include, we do it in the form of ice. We don't just put water in there. We're doing it in the form of ice to really help keep that meat cold, minimize that heat energy gradient that's going to happen as you have that mechanical friction occurring. With regard to salt, specifically in processed meats, I know there's so many different varieties out there. And we could probably spend hours even just talking about the varieties of just the salt itself. But something that I'd like to ask you, Dr. Tarté, is what considerations should processors think about when formulating a product, coming up with a new product, maybe, with regard to salt? And I'm pointing toward things like salt texture or salt type or salt purity, right? I mean, or kosher versus sea salt, et cetera. And that's a big question, I understand, but what kind of thoughts could you give our processor listeners?
Okay, so Yeah, as you alluded to, there are many, many different kinds of salt, especially these days, right? With the advent of clean, simple labels and trying to somehow kosher salt sounds better than, or sea salt sounds better than just salt. Most of the salt that we consume, if you go to the grocery store and buy salt, it's probably going to be mined rock, comes from salt rock, so it's going to be mined. If it's sea salt, anyone who's selling sea salt wants to label it as sea salt. Mm-hmm. Ironically, a side note here is I grew up in a coastal city where, and growing up, all of our salt was sea salt, right? Because that's the salt that you could get in that country. And I had no idea we were eating very exotic form of salt.
You're quite the gourmand, right? Yeah.
I would have appreciated it different, a little more back then growing up. But so here's my take on this. I think a lot of the salts, these different types of salts that you mentioned, have a lot to do more with product labeling and perception than real functionality. First things that you want to do is you want to make sure that you have a food grade salt, obviously. Back in the day, we would have said, make sure it's very high purity. So it's, 98, 99% salt, which is what commercial salt is going to be in terms of purity. And because in theory, some of these other salts like sea salts and things like that, they bring in what we would chemically call contaminants. Okay. Doesn't mean that it's inedible. It's just like chemical contaminant, bringing in other types of salts and things that could potentially even enhance lipid oxidation because they may be pro-oxidative. However, to be fair, from what I've seen in the last few years, and the way the industry has been applying these salts and using these salts, it does not appear to have been a problem. I mean, people are using sea salts and different things, and the products appear to be just fine. So I think, in my opinion, it's mostly what do you want to put on your product label? Okay, keep in mind that salt is salt, sodium chloride is sodium chloride, regardless of where it comes from. That doesn't change. So exactly why sea salt is perceived as probably because it's not as purified, and in the clean label arena, highly purified components or ingredients are kind of looked at in a negative way because they're perceived to have been manipulated to get them in that way. And so it's a matter of perception. So the only thing that I would really, really strongly say is whatever salt you choose to use, make sure you understand it really well, that you know what it is you're adding, that you know what the sodium chloride content is, or if there's a different salt. There's some types of sea salt that are what they're called lower sodium salts that may have other types of salts in there. Just know what you have in there, because remember that salt is also a flavoring agent. And so if you just start swapping this salt for another haphazardly, you may end up actually altering your product. And I would think to a greater degree, probably the saltiness perception and perhaps any effects on flavor that there could be. So choose your salt carefully, stick to it, understand it really well, understand the technical aspects of it, talk to your suppliers, make sure they give you all the technical data sheets and all that, and all that, and get a guarantee that they're always good, that they're going to ship you the same product every time.
Just like anything else, consistency matters, right? Yeah, especially in that final product with the ingredients that you use. Great answer.
Now, I know on the episode in Spanish, we visited about some salt alternatives. I mean, we have this tendency of a more conscious consumer that as soon as he grabs a meat product or any product, they'll go back and read at the label. What's your take on new alternatives as far as the meat industry move to maybe use other ingredients like potassium chloride or the other ingredients that may be used to maybe lower the concentration of salts?
Yeah. So as you alluded, as you said, potassium chloride is the main. Potassium chloride is very similar to common table salt, which is sodium chloride, except the sodium ion is replaced with potassium. So you basically can have similar saltiness impact without the sodium. Remember, it's always about, even though oftentimes people talk about salt reduction, it's really not about reducing salt, it's about reducing sodium. So, and sodium is not just in salt. There are other ingredients that we use that can also be significant sources of sodium. But since we're talking about salt, potassium chloride is the primary ingredient that's used. The main issue with potassium chloride is that it doesn't taste exactly like sodium chloride. It is salty, but it also has what many consumers describe as a metallic kind of aftertaste. And so therefore, for a lot of products, probably most, if not all products, there's going to be a threshold. So take an existing product where you want to replace sodium chloride with potassium chloride. You most likely will not be able to replace all the sodium chloride with potassium chloride, because you're going to be introducing some off notes that many of your consumers are going to be able to detect. So there's a threshold. In my experience, that threshold, that sodium reduction threshold, and this applies not just to salt, but also all other sodium contributing ingredients like sodium lactate or sodium phosphates, usually about 20 to 25%. It's about as much as total sodium replacement as most products can tolerate without getting into issues. Of course, many processors would prefer to replace all the sodium chloride with potassium chloride, because you're also thinking about your label, right? So if I replace 25% of my sodium chloride with potassium chloride, now I have two chlorides in my label. And the chlorides are chemical names that some are trying to stay away from. And so that's kind of a drawback there. It's easier to formulate a new product, a brand new product, than it is to actually change an existing product and start replacing ingredients. So there are other things, other alternatives that the industry can and has done. For instance, the use of certain types of flavor enhancers. Okay, so MSG is the one that comes to mind, monosodium glutamate. But there are other ingredients that are similar to monosodium glutamate. Okay, so they're basically very short chain peptides or amino acids, and monosodium glutamate is just the sodium salt glutamic acid, which is a common amino acid that we all consume every day. Mm-hmm. And so that will allow you to reduce some of the salt. Okay, so bring the salt down a little bit and enhance the flavor. You can do this in your own kitchen. If you're eating a product and say, instead of adding salt, add monosodium glutamate, you can buy that at the store. It's a common food ingredient. You will see that it does enhance flavor. It will not make the product salty. Okay, so it's because it's not salty. It's an enhancer. So it works for many products, not for all. Okay, and it usually works better. Monosodium glutamate works better for savory products. And thankfully, meat products are savory products, not like sweet products. If you add monosodium glutamate, MSG, to vegetables, you're not going to get much of a flavor impact, because there aren't that many flavor compounds in a lot of these products for the enhancement to take place. So that's that is one option, is to add an enhancer or a potentiator of flavor. Other ingredients that are out there are monosodium glutamate, as I'm sure a lot of listeners know, also has a bit of a bad rap, unfortunately, because it's not based on any scientific evidence. So many processors would rather stay away from MSG. So then you get into using, you could use hydrolyzed proteins. Keep in mind that the word hydrolyzed is the word that many consumers might stay away from, just because they don't understand what it means. But then there are things like yeast extracts. You may have seen on your labels, autolyzed yeast or yeast extracts. And the yeast extracts naturally contain many of the same flavor enhancers, such as MSG, but you're not adding the ingredient MSG. So you don't have to declare MSG on your label. You're adding a yeast extract. So that is one way to do that. One caveat here, when we're talking about using these ingredients to lower salt, is that we started out the conversation. Dr. Bass was talking at the beginning about salt as a preservative, right? That's the main reason. as consumers, we oftentimes forget that. Now, when you're in the industry, that's top of mind. But the average consumer probably doesn't even realize that. I mean, when's the last time you thought of salt as a preservative?
Mm-hmm.
When we are reducing total salt content, we are also reducing the total antimicrobial capacity of the system, so to speak. So you have to keep that in mind. So in the industry, and back when we had to make a conscious effort. Remember, guys, when we're reducing salt, total salt, replacing a certain amount of sodium chloride with potassium chloride will give you the same, because potassium chloride is also an antimicrobial. But if you're thinking, well, I'm not going to go the potassium chloride route, I'm just going to lower total sodium to have less sodium on my label, then you have to think of the microbiology. So you have to make sure that you're either validating your shelf life, you're validating the safety of your product, or you're at least making use of any of the microbiological predictive models that are out there. There's some really good models out there that processors can use. So just keep that in mind. The take-home message is not don't do it, just know the implications of any change you make. Most of the time, there are ways to mitigate any negative effects, but you have to understand what you're doing. Okay? You have to understand when you're replacing ingredients, adding ingredients, or taking away ingredients, there are always implications to that. And sometimes there are things that you may not be aware of that may be happening in the system. So other ways in which research that people have done on ways to try to maybe change this, the structure or the conformation, say, of meat proteins to make them a little more functional. I think most of this is kind of in research stages. Maybe it'll keep progressing to the point where we can actually, functionalize proteins a little more, so they would need less of the salt to do that water binding that we were talking about initially. So, yeah. So these are some of the ways in which the industry has taken on the challenge of reducing sodium in recent years.
There's so many. Wow. That was a great explanation of all the different avenues that we as meat specialists can go down to try to meet the suggestions of consumers, but then also make sure that we're still fulfilling the mission of providing a safe, wholesome, tasty food product that people are going to want to eat later on, right? Mm-hmm. So, and yet, for those out there listening, especially those in the graduate studies still, maybe conducting taste panels, I remember using potassium chloride specifically for anchoring the taste buds of taste panelists for the metallic flavor. It does leave that metallic flavor in your mouth. MSG, monosodium glutamate, is fantastic for helping people identify the savory umami notes that come out of meat products, especially salted meat products, which probably one of the reasons why we do still have this affinity toward these cured and salted meats that are out there. For our processing listeners, now, Dr. Tarté, I'll confess to you, I love salt. I love the taste of salt. I don't know if this isn't an advertisement for Malden sea salt, but if you're familiar with this, it's a smoked crystallized sea salt from England. And my wife and I will kind of just pop these and almost like popcorn. They're so tasty. I know it's terrible for you, but eating these little crystals, the texture is fantastic. The flavor is out of this world. Maybe we're outliers, and I'm okay with that. For the rest of the 95% of the bell curve, what kind of advice can we give to processors on amounts of salt to use? And just kind of going back to our basic sodium chloride mixture, what's not enough and what's too much for most consumers?
Okay, so let's start with the sensory aspect of salt, right? So the saltiness perception. How much is too much, right? You probably in your own kitchen know when you salted something too much. Your spouse would say, "This was salty, you ruined it," right? But you probably don't know how much that is.
Right.
You just know that today I had a heavy hand, and or the top fell off the salt shaker, and the whole thing fell in the bowl, or something like that. But we never really know. I can tell you for meat products, majority of processed meat products are going to tolerate about 1.5 to 2% salt of the total product. That is product dependent. It also depends on your consumer's preference. Sometimes I have products out there that I perceive as being very salty. How can this company be making a salty product? But they're selling it. So there are people who like it, right? So it's understanding who your consumer is and giving them what they like. But normally we're talking in the 1.5 to 2% range. If you're talking about sometimes poultry products, which are very bland in flavor, these products usually at 1.5% may start turning a little salty. So you may want to consider levels closer to 1%, 1.25% of your product. That's kind of a rule of thumb. Of course, you have to do your own testing and testing and tasting to come up with where you want to be. Now, there's another element here, which is not just the sensory attributes of the product, but during processing. We start out the conversation saying that salt helps extract some of the proteins in meat, primarily the protein myosin is the one that we're most concerned with. And in order to, myosin is soluble in salt solutions. When you add salt to meat, you're actually creating a solution of salt in the system as the salt interacts with the moisture, natural moisture is in the meat. We know that you need about 4% salt for optimal extraction of these proteins to get them out, to get them to dissolve, and so that their structures can be exposed and they can do their thing. So typically, when we're talking about, this is the reason that sausage makers will usually add their lean meat first, where most of their protein is, and then you add salt. If you calculate this, the salt percentage you're adding at that point in time, it's going to be 4 to 5%. And if you make a product like that, it's going to be terribly salty. But then you add your water and your fat and your other ingredients, so you dilute out the fat. So the recommendation is always to add more salt to increase what we call the ionic strength. Mix that with the meat for a while to get maximal extraction of myosin, and then come in with other ingredients that are not high protein ingredients like your fatty trimmings and all the other ingredients in water. And then that will eventually, you'll dilute out that salt to get it to that 1.5 to 2% level that your consumers are going to be able to tolerate. Some products you may not be able to do this. For instance, if you're injecting a ham, right? You really only have one meat raw material, and you don't want to destroy it because it's meant to be an intact muscle product. But in products like sausage, that is usually the way you want to go about it first. So keep in mind, have that 4 to 5% salt in going with your lean, but try to finish at about 1.5 to 2% salt after all is said and done.
Final product, 1.5 to 2%. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
that's great. And
I think we're almost wrapping up this episode. I think we can go for hours and just keep this conversation. And hopefully, when we're back at RNC in Nevada, I think we can continue this conversation, maybe in a different non-meat ingredient. But I think before we go, I would like to ask you, and I think Dr. Bass is gonna remember this, but I'm very interested, and maybe other folks that are also listening to this podcast, and maybe grad students, and maybe folks like are in your shoes, maybe wanting to go back to academia after many years in the industry, in the private sector, looking at that option. Could you please tell us about what do you take into consideration? This is more about a personal question, obviously, but I think that's going to help other folks to just relate to what you did. How was that transition?
Yeah. So this is a question I get asked a lot, and there's never a really great answer, and I'll tell you because there are many considerations, right? So number one is, and for young people who may be listening, you have to be passionate about what you do. I enjoyed my time in the industry tremendously, learned a great deal, which is helping me in academia. I'll be honest with you. I never thought I'd go back to academia after a certain age. You're like, oh, just because you start as an assistant professor, you're usually young, usually in your late 20s and early to mid 30s. And then, by the time you're in your 40s, you're an associate professor and you keep progressing. I'm not gonna disclose my age, but I started a little later than that. And so it's very unusual. It's not completely unheard of. But it's very, very unusual. So you have to, when I was approached about this position that I'm in, if this individual hadn't approached me, I wouldn't be here, because I would not have thought, like, could they even potentially be interested in a guy, who was several years removed from his Ph.D. And so the more I thought about it, so here are the reasons that number one is getting back into research and doing research that is more self-directed and not direct. When you work in the industry, your goal is to help your company be successful, right? And oftentimes the goals are placed in front of you, and even the projects that you work on, until you progress up the ladder and you're the one who starts making those decisions. But and it's all a function, which is just fine. But in the academic world, I can be a little bit more creative, self-directed. For those of you who are considering this, keep in mind also that you also have to do what research you do also depends on the type of funding you get, right? You need money to do research. So you may have the greatest ideas, but if no one wants to fund your idea, you will not be doing research in that. So you have to also keep that in mind. So that's the counterpart to that. Another aspect is the education part, working with young people who are the future of the industry. So I feel that people who have worked in the industry come back to academia. We have a lot to share, and we complement our colleagues. So our colleagues who have been in academia the whole career, we complement them nicely, and I mean that totally. There's a compliment because they bring a lot of very nice things to the table, and then we bring something else, and then we complement and we complete the academic program, so to speak. So working with the young people and being able to tell them anecdotes about what it's like in the industry, and when they do internships, and then they tell you about it, and you can identify with that and share with them. So, and then just be able to be in class with them and interject some of your experiences, some of your real life experiences into the classroom environment, I think is a real plus. I will tell you one thing though, and Dr. Bass may chuckle about this, but finances are should not be your primary motivator, right? It's not about money. When you go up the corporate ladder, you keep climbing. We all know that compensation in academia it tends to be a little lower than that. So when you do something like this, of course, you will take that into consideration, right? You don't do it for the money. You do it because it's what you want to do. It's where you want to be. So for me, so far, I think it's been a great decision. Like what I do, stay very busy, busier sometimes than we have time for, but I take that over the alternative. So it's been great.
Yeah, it's about doing what's it's about following your passion, right?
Right.
And we keep having it seems like we keep having folks say that whether in academia or in industry or in government, whatever that path
Right.
that life leads you down.
And the other thing, Phil, is the other thing is don't let yourself be boxed into stereotypes. Like there's a stereotype that young professor studying academia and someone in the industry comes, makes you a very nice offer that you can't refuse, and then you jump and go. And a lot of people do it that way. And so there's kind of the thought that that's the way it is, but why not the other way around? The other way around can also happen. And so it's less traditional, but it doesn't mean that your career, don't ever think that you're not going to do something. For me, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be here sitting in Ames, Iowa, talking to you about what I do here at Iowa State University, I would say you are nuts. Right? You're crazy. That's not the way my career is going. But you have to be willing to kind of break the mold and don't tie yourself. Sometimes we tie ourselves into the stereotypes as well, the stereotypical way of doing things. It's academia first, industry later. Well, you can do industry first, academia later. So
Awesome. I think this is great. It has been a great conversation. And as Dr. Bass alluded to, you're not the first one who mentions do what you love to do. So I think that's something there that we have to just be passionate about what we do. And if it's something non-traditional, well, go at it and do it. If that's what makes you happy, I think we got to keep doing that. Anything else to add, Dr. Bass?
Well, I love the philosophical discussions that we have in the end, and it's so true that if you find something that you love doing, it's not work. And back to our processing partners out there, I hope you love what you do, because you're doing great things. You're feeding the world. You're providing great nutrition that tastes good, and salt is part of that. And I really appreciate Dr. Tarté spending this time with us, talking about a non-meat ingredient as it relates to meat. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you the next couple weeks. Thank you.
That we end this episode. Thank you a lot for listening. If you'd like to receive notifications on the new releases and the new episodes, please subscribe at www.meatspad.com. If you're a small and mid-sized meat processor and you have concerns or questions about a certain topic related to meat science and meat processing, please email us at info@meatspad.com. Thank you, and see you the next time.